So Tim and I are going to talk today about some of the automated identification methods that we use in the laboratories. I am going to be focusing on the Vitek 2. Again, my name is Eric Beck. I'm from, where am I from? Advocate Health now, whatever we're called this month, at ACL Laboratories in Illinois and Wisconsin. So you can start, yeah. Trying. Okay, so I'm going to start quickly with a case study that we saw in our laboratory. I'm not going to focus too much on the background, but more the lab component of it. So we had a positive blood culture submitted from an ED patient in our laboratory. The aerobic bottle was positive, showing the presence of gram-negative rods. Within our lab, we run the biofire test on positive blood cultures, and it gave us the results positive for Enterobacterales and Proteus species. So upon subculture, the plate showed swarming motility. It was a non-lactose fermenter on McConkey, and it was oxidase negative. It did not actually go on the MALDI. It went on our Vitek 2 and gave us a result of Proteus peneri. It's really slow to advance, Aaron. Push it really hard, Tim. Okay. All right. So a question then. Do we accept the Vitek 2 result as Proteus peneri? Yes, it's swarming and it gives away the Proteus species. Yes, because the BCID2 indicated that it was a Proteus species. No, you should only blindly trust the MALDI. Or no, there's still relevant information we don't know. I will point out and cheat for those of you that don't have the Vitek. The Vitek ID card does not tell you an indole reaction if that changes your mind. So go ahead and. How many were there? About 4? Okay. All right. Seems like they're slowly stopping. Good work, guys. Okay, so the slides are a little spaced, a little funny. Sorry about that. So the organism was indole positive. If you recall, this is now obviously a tiny chart up here, but this is a chart from the Manual of Clinical Microbiology indicating Proteus peneri is generally indole negative, which obviously disagrees with what we see in the laboratory. Ultimately, when we went back and did get a MALDI-TOF identification of this, it turned out to be Proteus vulgaris, which does match with our indole results, and ultimately that's how it was reported. So I guess the point is there is always additional information you can know. As Alana pointed out, don't blindly trust things. We still need to use our brains as we're going through this. So I'm going to quickly give you some background on just how the Vitek identification panels work in general. These are identification panels designed for use with the Vitek 2 instruments. They generally work, there's several different types of Vitek 2, so this picture up here may not represent what yours looks like, but it works with all the different types of Vitek 2 instruments. There are options available for identification of gram-negative bacilli, gram-positive cocci, pathogenic yeast, fastidious gram-negatives, and anaerobic bacteria. So very quickly starting the process out, it includes a DensiCheck instrument. This is the older version on the top and the newer version on the bottom. These are the components used to make a 0.5 McFarland suspension to set up and inoculate your tests. So basically you prepare the suspension, place it in the reader, and adjust as needed. This newer version down here is actually Bluetooth capable and it allows us to incorporate what the actual McFarland reading was on our final reports, which actually allows us to potentially monitor whether our text made the McFarlands correctly, or if there was some error. It allows us to do some competency review and things like that. In disclaimer, we actually don't use it in our laboratory. So, but in theory, it's possible. So this is what a Vitek identification card looks like. They're microfluidic cartridges. They're about the size of a playing card. They have this inoculation straw on the side. And basically they get set up. There's a boat. You can see the tube with your suspension. Here's the cards, and the straw gets placed into your suspension. And then the whole instrument goes into the whole boat of cards goes into the Vitek instrument. Each card has a barcode on it, which helps identify the test card and the sample that's being placed in there. And once they go into the instrument through a series of vacuum steps, the suspension basically gets pumped into each card, and each of these wells within the little card is filled up. Each well contains a different reaction, essentially. As the test cards incubate in the instrument, eventually you see some color changes and things like that. And the instrument will actually interpret these color changes as positive or negative results on the instrument and read the results. And then once the cartridges are read, I should note, in order to seal the cards, there's actually a heated element that cuts the straw off, seals these up in the initial inoculation process. And then when the card itself goes into the instrument for reading, whereas the suspension and the cut off straw comes back out for us to discard. So ultimately, the cards are read on the instrument, and we get the results. So I'm going to talk mostly about the gram-negative ID panel, but a lot of the other cards work very similarly. So the gram-negative ID panel identifies clinically significant glucose fermenting and non-fermenting gram-negative rods. It has a series of 47 different biochemical reactions. These include things like carbon source utilization, enzymatic activities, and there's a few resistance type of mechanisms in there. It does take about 10 hours to get the results for this test, and generally once the results are done, it compares all of the biochemical reactions to a known database of reactions for certain other bacteria to determine what is the best fit. This is going to be a little bit hard to see, but I will try and walk you through it. So it does give you a result report. The top part here has patient information, things like that, who set it up, that type of thing. It has information about the test card showing which test you ran, lot numbers, time it was run, time it came off. And then down here are all the individual biochemical results. It shows whether each reaction was positive, negative, et cetera. And then in the middle portion here, it actually gives you the result. You can see in this one, well, you can't see probably, but in this one it was Rallotella planticola. It gave us it says right here that 99% probability that this is the correct identification. So it gives you some idea of how confident this result is. Occasionally there will be messages, and I'll show you an example of that in here, things that it doesn't like or things that may not make sense, things to double check. So the report itself is pretty easy to interpret. This is the results section for a less obvious one. So in this case, when the test cannot discriminate between multiple organisms, it lists what those possible organisms could be. In this case, several Shigella species and an E. coli. It does include some of the additional messages. In this case, it suggests maybe using serological testing. And it also includes biochemicals that may help you discriminate how you would differentiate these organisms. So in this case, it's telling you If you had a ornithine decarboxylase broth, you may be able to differentiate Shigellas from E. coli's. I would be willing to bet nobody except maybe Dr. Munson out there has an ornithine decarboxylase broth in their lab anymore. But nevertheless, there's that opportunity. It also gives you some results down here of things that may not fit. So you can't really see it, but for example, it's indicating that the Shigella, most of them are phosphatate positive, whereas in this reaction it must have been negative. Similarly, it says E. coli, most of them are, God, that's small, mannitol positive, and in this case, the reaction would have been negative. So it does give you some helpful information, ways to differentiate if you're kind of stuck in between two identifications and things like that. There's also the Vitek gram-positive ID panel, primarily used for identifying staph, strep, enterococci, and a few other clinically relevant gram-positives. This one contains 43 biochemical reactions, again measuring carbon source utilization, enzymatic activity, and resistance mechanisms. It's a little bit faster, it takes about 8 hours compared to the gram-negative panel. And again, it compares the results of it to a database for other known gram-positive cocci. The report looks very similar. I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but it does essentially the same thing. Yeast. There is a panel for yeast. We do use this one in our laboratory occasionally as well. Allows us to identify Candida species, Cryptococcus, and a few other clinically relevant yeast. It does now, assuming you're using the most current software, allow you to accurately identify Candida auris and differentiate it from other Candida species. This one includes 46 biochemical reactions. It takes a little bit longer to identify yeast. This one takes about 18 hours. But again, same story where it compares the results of these biochemical reactions to a known database to determine what yeast it is. So real quickly, some inherent issues, and I've already touched on them in our case studies, but a few other things to note. The database of organisms in these instruments is much smaller than is in our current MALDI-TOF databases. Occasionally you'll see that it requires confirmatory testing, and that is in that example I showed you earlier. And again, the way most of our labs operate these days, we probably don't have access to a lot of the confirmatory tests it recommends, so that can be a struggle. We do see that it struggles a little bit to ID different species within complexes. I think I spelled Acinetobacter baumannii wrong there, so forgive me on that one for whoever saw that out there. But we see things like Citrobacter freundii complex and Acinetobacter baumannii. It doesn't always get the species right. It's generally in the correct complex, but not always to the species being correct. As I mentioned, these do lack some obvious reactions like indol and oxidase, so you do need to make sure you're doing those reactions separately before you load some of these cards. And again, we do see some issues differentiating things like E. coli and Shigella, which we see in a lot of our instrumentation. And it takes, I say long time here, 8 to 12 hours. I guess long in relation to a MALDI type of setup. That's still, I guess, fairly quick in terms of old microbiology. But it does, hopefully you can see that we still do need to use some critical thinking to use this instrument, right? We need to retain some general knowledge of basic biochemicals that aren't included on the panel. Gram stains, obviously, indol, oxidase, catalase, LAP for some of the gram positives. These are things that are not on the panels and will help us differentiate some of the organisms that we're identifying and help us understand whether that card is actually giving us the correct result. So the other thing we need to maintain critical thinking is we have a lot of different instrument systems in the lab, including our molecular testing and our MALDIs. Occasionally, these will get tested by 2 different methods. How do we know which one is correct? So we need to, again, continue to use that critical thinking, right? And for those of us who don't have every biochemical reaction memorized, how do you figure out what's correct, right? Well, I hate to say Google, but Google is available in every laboratory. Make sure you use a reputable site if you're doing this. But a better resource would be something like the Manual of Clinical Microbiology. Hopefully most of you have access to that in your laboratory. It has a lot of tables that will give these standard biochemical reactions and help you determine whether your ID makes sense with some of the things that you're seeing. So real quickly, in summary, the Vitek 2 cards, identification cards, are available for several different groups of organisms: gram-negative rods, gram-positive cocci, yeast, anaerobes, and the fastidious organisms. The results actually take 8 to about 18 hours for the yeast, and there are some limitations, including the nomenclature not being updated as frequently as the MALDI-TOF, the database being a little bit smaller. Obviously, these are not end all. The answer is always correct, so they require our technologists to maintain their critical thinking skills and recall some of the basic biochemical reactions for many of the organisms we see routinely. And lastly, our technologists need to have access to helpful resources in the form of their peers, literature, Manual of Clinical Microbiology. These things are things that I think if you don't have them available, you still need to fight for them to be in your laboratory. Well, colleagues, obviously, you need to fight for them to be in your laboratory, but some of these books like the Manual of Clinical Micro and other things like that as well. So, Erin, how do you want to do this? Questions for Tim and I at the end?
We'll do it at the end.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's all I had on the Vitek. I'm going to hand it over to Tim to talk about the Phoenix and the Microscan. You have,
No.
C was the,
Next.
yeah, you gotta push it kind of hard.
Okay. Then how did you get the?
The poll is
Yeah,
A.
Got it.
It'll bring it up and start it, and then A will stop it. B shows the graph.
Perfect. Should be a cheat sheet. All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Tim Block. I am the manager of the laboratory out at Froedtert West Bend Hospital, as the name indicates, in West Bend. I'm going to be talking a little bit about, we're tag team a little bit, but I'm going to be talking about the Phoenix and the Microscan identification systems. I'm going to start with a small case study, like Dr. Beck did, and I'm going to move into some background of the instrumentation, and then follow up with some more case studies and some literature review on them. So first, we're going to start with this particular case study. It was a patient that we had come in, was admitted to the ED. Diagnosis was pancreatitis. Provider, in addition to the routine blood work, also ordered a urinalysis and a blood culture. Blood culture flags positive after about 17 hours of incubation. We do a gram stain on it. It comes out to be a gram-negative bacilli, and we use the Luminex Verigene panel in our laboratory, so we set that panel up per normal protocol. That panel comes back with a answer of Enterobacter species. Okay, so we report that out as our preliminary result, call it to the pharmacist, things are looking good for us. The next day, we have this growing on our McConkey auger. It's a lactose fermenter, light pink, not too mucoidy, just not too dry, just a your regular gram-negative rod. And again, according to our normal protocol, we set up a Phoenix gram-negative panel, which comes up with a result of Klebsiella oxytoca, in direct contrast to what we got on the Verigene panel. So the question of the day is, what do we do? Do we accept the Phoenix ID? Do we override the Phoenix ID with the results obtained from the Verigene, in other words, just report it out as the Enterobacter species? Do we do additional work? Or do we just call it a day, give up, and go home? It's only 8 o'clock in the morning, but I don't want to think.
Tim, what were the susceptibility results?
We'll get to that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
All right, what did we choose? All right, everyone's catching on. We are going to do some additional work on this, except for probably the 2 people from my laboratory who decided to go home. All right, how do I clear that? Okay, all right, so we're going to put that aside for a little bit. We're going to talk about this, and then we'll circle back around to the case studies at the end. So the BD Phoenix. So I think we did the same type of scenario last spring when we talked about susceptibility testing. And at the time, I recall the majority of the users in the room were using either the Vitek or the Microscan. So the Phoenix was something not a lot of people were familiar with. I'm not going to go completely in depth, but I will give an overview again about it for the people that weren't here last year. So the BD Phoenix instrument looks like this, very similar to other automated instrumentation. It has a 50, currently the instrument is called an M50, it has a 50 panel capacity. Your ability to stack 2 panels together so you can have 100 panel capacity for the larger laboratories. The setup of it is relatively manual, which I will go over, but there is also a AP instrument which does the dilutions for you so that you can just automates that a little bit for workflow purposes. So the basic workflow is, it has these little trays. I think this is a pointer. It has these little trays where you can put your panel and your inoculation tubes. The workflow is you'll first set up a 0.5 McFarland in your initial ID tube, and then you will use a reader to set it to the right density. You have to add a drop of broth of AST indicator into the AST tube. We went over that last year, but that is the AST section is fluorescent, so it needs that indicator. You'll transfer a small suspension into the AST tube, mix them both up, and then you have to take both of these tubes and pour them into these little holes here in which then the inoculum trickles down and fills up all the wells. The AP portion of it creates a suspension for you. You just make a suspension. It automatically dilutes it to the right density, the right 0.5 McFarland. It does the transfer into the AST broth, and then it comes out the other side, and you still need to manually inoculate the panels. The final steps are you cap the panels so nothing leaks out and no air gets in, and load the panels onto the instrument. They load vertically. And then the instrument takes an initial read, just like a lot of automated instrument takes an initial read at 20 minutes to get the baseline reading, and then it'll read it every 20 minutes for up to about 16 hours until you get a result. Identification of it is very much like the Vitek. It works off conventional biochemicals. Some of those are chromogenically read at the end. There are a few fluorogenic biochemicals in there as well. And then just like the Vitek, it compares the results against the database and then will give you a result. There are panels available for gram-positive, gram-negative. There's a separate panel for strep, your beta hemolytic streps and your strep pneumos and things like that. And there are panels available for yeast as well. This is an exhaustive listing of the claims of the gram-negative organisms it will identify. I don't throw this up there expecting you guys to memorize it, but just to let you know it's quite a large list. Same thing for the gram-positive, and then the strep is a little smaller, and then the yeast that it claims it will identify. The identification, so this is in contrast to like the Vitek system or the Microscan system where it will give you the identifications and then a percentage, that it thinks that it is. The Phoenix will only give you an identification if it meets a 90% threshold. Okay, so if it's at 86, 89%, according to its database, it won't even give you an ID. It'll say it's unidentified. As far as performance characteristics, this is based on the product insert. Gram-negative, it says it'll identify gram-negative organisms about 96% of the time to the species level. Gram-positive, very similar at about 95%. The Microscan is something more you may be familiar with, either from your workplace, from college, from your clinicals, whatever it might be. This again is one of the current configurations of the Microscan walkaway. It is based off of your traditional biochemicals, miniaturized, so this is a lot of things that, again, Dr. Munson might have in his laboratory in large tubes, or we may have done in class at some point in large tubes, all miniaturized into little microtiter wells. Panel inoculation for this can be simplified. Traditionally, it was very similar to the Phoenix where you had to make a suspension initially and then transfer some over into another broth. The people at Microscan were able to streamline this a little bit with the prompt system. So you can't see this here because of the coloring on it, but it is a little bottle. And inside that bottle is your diluent. And in order to inoculate it, there's a little wand. And at the back end of this wand, it kind of looks like I always described it as a waffle. So you touch several colonies, and that grabs the organism. You pull this little shield off, and that'll take any of the bug that's stuck to the side of the wand, so that the only bug you're inoculating is in the waffle area. Put it in the diluent, shake it up, get a good mix of it, and then you pour it into this inoculation tray, and then you use this re-knock inoculator to inoculate all the wells at once. Then they are loaded into the instrument. Again, very similar to the Phoenix, conventional biochemicals. There's some chromogenic biochemical, enzymatic biochemical reactions. Panels available for gram-positive, gram-negative strep. And there are also panels available for yeast and Haemophilus and anaerobes, and those are 4-hour identification panels. I don't have a lot of familiarity with these particular panels. Again, an exhaustive listing of the gram-negative organisms that it claims to be able to identify, strep and gram-positive organisms, strep and staph, and then the yeast panels as well. So again, I don't show these for you guys to memorize them, just so you know that there's an exhaustive listing of what they claim that they can identify. So as far as the identification, it will provide an ID regardless of the percentage. If it's a low percentage, it'll give you the separate, organisms, and then maybe what percentage it thinks it is, and then offer additional biochemicals in order to delineate the identification. According to package insert performance characteristics, it'll a little bit better than the Phoenix, 97% agreeable to the species level. Gram-positive, also 97% for staph, and about 92% for strep. So the one thing that I found interesting when I was reviewing the product inserts is it had this little caveat in it, that these performance characteristics were based on the type of bacterial population expected in a routine clinical laboratory. Okay, so when you think back to that exhaustive list of bugs that it claims to identification, those aren't all ones that you expect to see in a clinical laboratory. So keep that in mind. So I wanted to do a little bit of literature research to see what has been done, what has been studied, how accurate are these. And I found a couple things. Is one, either my ability to search PubMed is not nearly as good as my child's ability to search Google, or there's just not a lot of information out there. So keep in mind when some of these performance characteristics were done in the product inserts, they were done against traditional biochemicals before we had MALDI, before we had other molecular ways to do it. So I found 3 that specifically talked about the Microscan. The first one up here is comparing it against MALDI, and it's this one was looking specifically at Acinetobacter. The second one was looking at Rolotulia. And again, I think this one is not in the title, but I think this was comparing it against some kind of molecular technology, maybe sequencing even. And the last one, again, was looking at Enterococcus specifically against MALDI. So Acinetobacter found for Microscan, it's got about a 13% error rate in identification of Acinetobacter. And again, much like the Vitek was, a lot of this was involved in the speciation of the ones that were in the complex organisms. Okay? When we looked at Rolotulia, had about a 92.6% accuracy in that identification. And then when we looked at Enterococcus, this one was really interesting. It only had a 71% accuracy in identification of Faecium. Okay, and there was 29% of those bugs that were actually identified as Acasa flavus. Okay, so that can be a big difference in a clinical picture. This actual study actually did include the Phoenix and the Vitek as well, and both of them performed at 100% accuracy. Looking at the Phoenix, I found 2 articles. The first one talked about the identification of beta hemolytic strep, and then the second one talked about gram-negative bacilli. The beta hemolytic strep in the Phoenix did relatively poorly at only about a 79% accuracy. which in the reality of things that we work in the clinical laboratory, this is probably not too important. I don't think that we put a lot of beta hemolytic strips on our automated instrumentation for identification. I just found it as an interesting comparison. But the gram-negative one was actually real interesting. Again, it compared it against MALDI, and what it found was it had, the Phoenix did a 83% correct ID down to the species level. Okay, so if you think about this study versus what the package insert says, much different, right, by about 10, 12%. But when you break it down even more, it did really good, again, with those common organisms. And in this study, the common organisms were Enterobacteriales, Pseudomonas, Stenotrophomonas. When you got into the uncommon organisms, some of the other non-fermenters and things you don't see that often, 34%. So again, keep in mind what your target is, what you're expecting. Okay, so let's go back to our initial case study. Enterobacter versus Kleb, oxy. What do we do next? The correct answer is you guys all got it, other than a couple people, was we're going to do some additional work. Our investigation was limited, but one of the first things you start at, and we'll get into this a little bit more with other presentations, is that there is a limitation on the Verigene that says rare strains of Kleb may cross-react with probes and provide an Enterobacter detected result. Okay. Now this is specific actually to other Kleb species other than the Oxytoca, which we got, but it is enough to tweak a little bit of thought process, right? Second thing is Dr. Munson asked, what's the susceptibility? So our susceptibility panel, which you can't see here because it's kind of small, but the cefazolin was tested as resistant. Now this isn't going to be completely definitive, but looking at our susceptibility profile on our antibiogram, we expect a 0% susceptibility for Enterobacter, and in our laboratory, Kleb Oxy has about a 60% susceptibility rate. Okay, so not definitive, but this is pointing probably away from the Kleb result. What we did in this case, because we had differing answers, is we are lucky enough to be affiliated with our reference laboratory that does MALDI and is staffed by some excellent experts. We sent it down to them, and they identified it as an Enterobacter cloacae complex. So in this case, it agreed with the original Verigene result. Just a couple other case studies to go through. And again, it just kind of highlights how we have to think and that we can't just blindly accept what we see on our results. So one morning I walked into the lab and I was doing my morning hellos and whatever, and the people on micro were just getting going. And the question was, hey, do we care about a listeria in a urine specimen? And I thought, that's an interesting question. Never ran across that. Went back and looked at the printout from the Phoenix, and we have a organism name of Listeria monocytogenes / inocua. Okay, so I know that it gave it at least a 90% confidence level. Otherwise, we wouldn't have got an organism, a call on it. Actually, it gave us a confidence level of 99%. There was this little caveat at the bottom. It says the instrument produced the ID of Listeria monocytogenes / inoculum. Monocytogenes is beta hemolytic on sheep blood, and inocula is not. Okay, that's great if you're trying to differentiate between the two of them, but in this case, it didn't help us because the main question was the Listeria. Case studies and literature can always help. I didn't do it at the time, but in review and prep for this, I did find some case studies that there's been a handful, about a dozen cases of Listeria monocytogenes reported in urine specimens. So it isn't out of the realm of possibilities. Typically in the older population, which this patient was 100, so he definitely fit that criteria. So I asked a couple questions. I said, what's the gram stain? What does it look like on the plates? Okay. This is what it looked like on the plates, and if you can't see very well, they're kind of small grayish white colonies with a very, very small alpha hemolytic look to them. Okay. So I looked at this and I said, yeah, this is probably not Listeria. It's a good teaching moment. Let's go through it. So what we ended up trying to do is, or what we ended up doing rather than wasting time and effort on the Phoenix and trying to get the same result again, is we did send it to our colleagues and they did a MALDI on it and we identified this as an Enterococcus faecalis. Okay. So again, making sure, I mean, and this is a simple one, making sure that everything matches up, gram stain, colony morphology, catalase result, things like that. And the last one I want to go through, I think it's the last one, is another blood culture. Bottle flakes positive after 24 hours. Varigene is set up and we get a bunch of not detecteds on the Varigene. After a day of growth, we have these tannish colonies on our chocolate agar, and on our blood agar plate, we've got some fine growth, but growing, so we're not throwing up a ton of red flags. Under our normal protocol, we set up a Phoenix identification, and we got a Rhodentobacter pneumotropicus, okay? And the question is what the heck is that? Okay, so we do some research, we dig into it, and it's actually an organism that is in the literature, kind of has the name suggest, affiliated with rodents, with work. So we tried to dig in and do a little background work on it, see if we could get any history on the patient. It was very vague, you know, patient just came into the ED not feeling well, like we normally get. So we tried it again on the Phoenix, and we came up with the exact same result, okay. Still not feeling comfortable with that. Again, we relied on our colleagues at our reference laboratory. Thank you guys. And they got a definitive identification of a Prophyllus. So again, even though the fact that we had a very high probability and confidence level, things that don't make sense need a little bit additional thought process to them. Okay, just some final thoughts, and this kind of goes over both of what I put in and what Dr. Beck also put in. One, automated identification systems are really good with common clinical isolates, okay? E. coli, Klebsiella, Pseudomonas, they're gonna knock those out of the park. Despite the claims of identifications of rare isolates should be questioned / confirmed. Okay, so when you get that thing that just doesn't make sense, or you haven't seen before, or you have to Google it to figure out what it even is, it's a good time to start questioning those. Organism identification should correlate with the culture type, clinical picture, patient demographics, things like that. Get as much information as you can about the patient before you make a definitive ID. And this one actually comes right out of the Microscan product insert. The interpretation of test results require trained clinical personnel, which you guys all are, who should use judgment, knowledge, and additional confirmatory tests where required prior to accepting the identification of an organism. You know, so basically in a nutshell, the Microscan product insert summed up while we're here today is it requires you guys as trained professionals to do some critical thinking. So, with that, I think we will open it up for any questions.
Okay. All right, so if anybody has any questions, how many of you are using one of these 3 instruments in your laboratory? I'm sure that they're pretty well in all of our laboratories. So do you have any questions or maybe even a comment, a story about something unusual that you saw, a weird ID that showed up? We'd love to hear about that. So please share. This is how we're all going to learn today, is by all of us sharing.
Hi, Rachel Leisman, Froedtert Health. I was wondering if you guys can comment on how you protocolize some of these backup methods where maybe there are red flags of it's a weirdo bacterium, it's something we don't recognize, but the system is telling you it's fine, and especially for younger techs, how do you work that into your protocols and training to ensure that they recognize those organisms?
That's a direct question for us.
Yes.
I don't do, I mean, I have a very small laboratory, very small pool of people that work in micro. I don't do formal rounds, but I make sure that I pop in first thing in the morning. Again, that's where I got the listeria question from, and several times throughout the day, and always encourage them, just ask me the questions, right? If something doesn't make sense, let's talk about it. And I think, you know, in things like this and just letting them know when we do get one, trying to use those as teaching moments to understand why we sometimes question those.
It's a great question. And especially for us in our laboratory where we have MALDI available, we tend to use the Vitek when the MALDI doesn't give us a result, right? So we really are kind of down to ornithine, right, which we're obviously not running. And so there's no formal protocol. I mean, we do, you know, I do rounds when I'm in, depending on what state I'm currently in, right? And they're generally encouraged to ask when they have some of these weird identifications, but it does get trickier with things like the example I showed with Proteus peneri, right, where that's not necessarily a weird one. You just, if they just weren't thinking about the indole reaction at the time or something, right? So I don't have a great answer for you, and I wish I did. Do you have a suggestion?
I was going to say, can we turn that back?
Okay.
Does anyone have protocols, or do we just kind of rely on seeing those things and grabbing anybody around us that we can show it to, and hopefully they remember it the next time?
I guess when we do like culture review.
Can you go to the microphone, please?
Hello, I'm Sarah. When we do culture review and we audit our cultures, that's where we can catch some weird MALDI ID results. So if biochemicals match, gram-stains match, that's all good, but when we have discrepancies, we can kind of catch it right there. So our audit, yeah.
Thank you. Jordan, go ahead, Mike.
I just try to keep a list of organisms that are oftentimes fictitious.
Okay, yeah, and we do know that each instrument has definite problems with certain organisms, so.
I am Eric, and that's a pretty scary image on the screen right now. Thank you both for your excellent presentation. And based on what Eric just said, now I have a question for both of you. So,
Great.
Tim, first of all, you're on Phoenix, right? You've converted to Phoenix?
Correct.
Okay, so I'm curious about this no identification when it's less than 90%, right? So I'm curious, how often does that come about with your techs, including the techs that go home for the day? And is there a general experience with culprit type of organisms that would give you that? And then I'll ask Eric a question, then I'll go sit down. Eric, you mentioned that when MALDI doesn't work, you go to Vitek. How frequently, ballpark, does that happen? And is there a sort of a culprit organism list that brings about that situation? Thank you.
Well, I didn't do my research well enough for that question.
I'll let you go first.
I unfortunately don't have a terribly good answer for either one of your questions, Eric. But I will ask the two people that, and just give me an idea, a ballpark. How often do we see? Because I don't review every single result that comes off the Phoenix. How often do we see something that comes off as unidentified? Okay. So the answer to that is not very often. My guess would be the culprit behind most of those would be a mixed culture type as opposed to a poor identification. You know, the one thing in our laboratory is, and it shows when I do our antibiogram and things like that, is being in a smaller community, in a small community hospital, we do see oddball things, which is why we need to learn to question them, but the vast majority of what we see are outpatient urines, E. coli and stuff like that. So I'm not expecting to see a lot of those because we don't have a very complex patient population. So I think the majority of those that come off, like I said, are probably a mixed culture type thing, or we didn't quite get a pure culture when we did the inoculum, or the culture isolates weren't isolated, colonies weren't isolated.
I was actually going to cheat as well and ask some of our techs how often do you see the MALDI fail where we're switching to Vitek? But, all right, so it doesn't happen a ton for us, Eric. In terms of what culprit organism, I don't know if there's a specific one that I would say. I mean, occasionally we'll see issues where it was just a bad spot and a very obvious organism comes up on the Vitek. We do some cultures for the zoo. We occasionally get some pretty wild organisms coming off of that, which I wouldn't really trust the results off of any instrument half the time for those, but I don't know what I'm looking for on those. So I don't have an obvious answer that fails frequently. Sure.
Come up to the microphone, please. We can't record it otherwise.
I have a bit of an answer to that question. So we also use MALDI for our...
Tip it down. Thank you.
I have a bit of an answer to that question. We also use MALDI as our primary identification. But where we see it failing most often is generally with like our skin contaminant considered GPRs, like our Corynebacteriums cause probably the most of our issues with our MALDI. It generally isn't our pathogens that are like not identifying, it's the skin contaminants that are not as crucial.
Sure, that's fair. I guess I would agree with that as well, yeah.
And are you distinguishing between no ID or wrong ID?
I think the question, at least as posed to me, was no identification.
Yeah, that's how I was interpreting it as well. I'll leave that other piece of that question alone.
So I'll stay.
Oh, great.
Okay, Heather, go ahead with your question.
All right, my question isn't just for you, but for any Vitek users in the room. So since we know Vitek doesn't do that oxidase indol, I'm wondering if anyone has those built into their LIS or are you just relying on your text to run an oxidase and indol and then know that the results fit with the organism ID? Or is it built in somewhere where, maybe your LIS captured that and says, wait a minute, this doesn't match?
So for us, we are relying on our techs. It would be great if we could build that in there. I think that would be a ton of work. It certainly would be valuable, I think, specifically for at least some of those Proteus type species where I think Proteus is probably the one that jumps out at me at the most where we get burned because of the indol reaction. So if there's a way to build it, it might be useful, but right now we're relying on knowledge.
Can I ask a question about that? And this is going back in the Wayback Memory Bank. The original Vitek, didn't it have marks on the card where you had to mark, and was it for oxidase or indol? Which one was it? And catalase for staffs? Okay. So then the Vitek would incorporate that into its ID, but the Vitek 2 doesn't have that, right? No. Yeah, okay.
No, it has a beta-lactamase option for positives where you can tell it beta-lactamase positive or negative, but it has nothing for the gram-negative rods. I'll tell you, we're guilty of not doing oxidase and indol routinely, so we don't use it half of the time, but.
And I think that, that's one of the things that I try to, and I don't work a lot with the students that we have, but I try to get to them and to our newer techs in micro is don't forget the basics, right? I mean, I think it's very easy, and we're all on high-paced laboratories, a lot of workload, we're trying to get through the things, but don't forget the basics of doing your gram stain, your catalase, your oxidase, your indols, because that's information that when you do get something that doesn't work is going to help. And then, it's don't forget the basics.
So does anyone have a list of gram-negative rods and what are oxidase and indol results? Do you?
I would like it.
That's a Google question.
Or phone a friend and email it to me.
We actually have an Epic Beaker decision trees built in there. So if we're going to manually identify something, it doesn't let us bypass the indol or oxidase result. We have to put that in there. And then based off of, if we call it metallic, oxidase positive, non-lactose fermenting, it automatically populates a Pseudomonas aeruginosa in there, same with E. coli. The problem with moldy now is that we don't put manual workups in, so we don't get that anymore. But if we're going to still manually identify, we'll get those results in there.
Hi, I'm Tom Novicki from Marshfield. So, Tim, I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but,
I thought you were going to ask him a question.
well, you know, I think we think about this a lot because we've had a MALDI-TOF. We had a number of them now. We started with Bruker, and now we have Vitek, MS. So, you know, you say, you know, we're going to talk about this after the break, but, you know, you say you send it to, it's probably Nate and Blake's lab, right? You know, for the MALDI and for the definitive ID, but, you know, as sort of using them as your reference laboratory, you know, what do you do with that result when it comes back?
Sure.
Do you guys, your techs still look at it? And then, you know, because I think that's you know, and it's a really easy path to go down even, you know, for us who think we're great at critical thinking is, oh, the MALDI said it's this, you know?
Yeah.
So I'm curious to hear from you. We kind of deal with this because we do have the MALDI, but sometimes we have a question ID and we send it to Mayo, you know, and I know I would like to be able to specify get sequencing on it, but they have a pathway where, you know, my understanding is they put it MALDI-TOF. Now they're using, I think, the Bruker with their RUO database, you know, but we're kind of with the same thing as the result comes back and I say, well, you know, don't take it verbatim. For me, maybe I'm old school. I think, you know, 16S is, you know, kind of still the gold standard, but I'm wondering how, you know, when you get that result back, what do you guys do with it?
Sure. Well, we actually, not to correct you, Tom, but there's been a changeover. So what used to be Nate and Blake's lab is now Dr. Leisman's and Dr. Wood's lab, who are in our presence today. So, you know, we're in a unique situation because we do have such a strong affiliation with them. And I mean, it's similar to other, you know, smaller laboratories that have an affiliation. I don't do a lot of extra work in my laboratory. So if we get something that we're struggling with, quite honestly, I send it down to who the real experts are, okay? And I rely on them and their expertise to vet those. You know, we have those conversations. If it's something that is really odd and I'm concerned about, or I will give them a heads up and say, hey, we got this from a blood culture and it's kind of odd. You know, this is kind of what I know about the patient data, and we'll have that conversation. I used to get called, and I hope we still will have these conversations when they get an identification. We get that interaction. They'll say, hey, we just identified this. Does it make sense? You know, do you want to check with your ID doc? Or they'll have the conversation directly with the ID doc to make sure it makes sense before they report it. So they do the majority of the vetting for us before they give out the identification, which we truly appreciate. So thank you. You know, and then I always try to circle back around. If I know there's something that's been difficult that we're working on, follow up on it. The techs probably hate me. I come in every day and I say, hey, did we get the identification on it yet? Just so that we can circle back around and again, try to have that learning moment together in the laboratory and our laboratory as to what the identification was. So, thank you.
All right, good. More questions.
All right, I just have one. Maybe it's a broader question, but how often, if ever, do you just not get an ID, and then when that happens, do you just put your own name on it and just say, you know, I just got a new thing? How often do you identify a new organism?
I put Tim's name on it. It doesn't happen a lot. Depending on what the culture type is, if it's a blood culture, we'll usually send it out for sequencing. If it is a urine culture and it's at a very low concentration, we may call it a gram-negative rod, unable to further ID. Some of it depends on the clinical situation and how far we're going to really fight this thing out. We don't make up a name. I don't put Tim's name on it. So
I would have the same answer. You know, again, we'd have the conversation with our experts at the reference laboratory and decide how deep we need to go into it, how clinically significant is it, you know, what's the patient situation, are they still sick, do they really need an ID for epidemiology, those types of things go into it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times when we have to send these out to get an ID, by the time we get them back, the patient's already, their antibiotic course is already over and they're better and we don't see them again, so sometimes it's not even worth it.
Hey, great talks. Al Bateman, State Lab. I have a question about the different cards. Like, what happens if you put the wrong card, if you use the wrong card? Probably not GPCs with a gram-negative, but like gram-negative, the Vitek with the normal gram-negatives versus fastidious, or with the other ones, the gram-positive versus the streps. What's your experience with the cards and if there's misidentifications there?
It happens.
It happens. And my experience is one of two things will happen, is we will either not get an identification at all, or, because that card, that panel doesn't know what kind of bug you put in there, you'll get an ID sometimes, and that's where, the basic things the basic tests need to come back into play. What was the gram stain, correlate it with the gram stain, the catalase, things like that. So it does happen, and you just need to be aware and not blindly accept.
I think for the most part, we get a pretty goofy ID when that happens. But again, that is, one of those things. If a gram-positive shows up and your gram stain is a gram-negative, like hopefully our techs are questioning that. But it can happen.
Dawn from Upland Hills in Dodgeville. We had a situation that I thought was kind of interesting. We also have Epic and we use the workup tree. And we had a gram-negative rod that the workup tree, it was indole positive, it was beta hemolytic, oxidase negative, but it was also lactose negative, which in our instance, we have set it up to put it on the Vitek for an identification. The Vitek identified the organism as 99% Proteus mirabilis. For a newer tech who doesn't go back to thinking about things, it would have been, okay, 99%. But it was indole positive, and it was beta hemolytic, which to me did not match Proteus mirabilis. So we sent it into our reference lab, and they got a Morganella. We had repeated this again with the organism on our Vitek and got the same Proteus mirabilis. We ended up sending it in to bioMérieux for a case study. They ran it on the Vitek. They got a Proteus mirabilis. They also ran it on a couple of different platforms and got Morganella. And the ultimate answer was, we don't know why this happened, but it did, and we're going to go with Morganella because it was the higher percentage of probability, because 2 of the 3 platforms they ran it against said it was Morganella. So I guess my point is, what we see in newer techs all the time, and in not just micro, but everywhere, is that if a machine puts out an answer, it does not mean it's actually correct. And you have to go back and use what you know, the critical thinking, and that's a skill, as you said earlier, that only comes over time. And for the younger techs who are just getting started, that is a really hard thing to think about, because they just feel like the instrument said it was right. And it's just kind of like a sensitivity coming out where the Vitek says it's an ESBL positive on the well, but all of the antibiotics have MICs that indicate sensitive. Does that really make sense? No, it really doesn't. And maybe you should just repeat that. But a lot of people will just go, yep, it's ESBL. We're going to send it out to be worked up if we don't have a history. And of course, it turns out that it's not. So just an interesting kind of scenario.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a really beautiful way to put that. And I kind of had an interesting career path that I started out right out of college at a very big lab. I worked at Mayo Clinic in Rochester. And so we went from having every sort of resource available, including MALDI, to a smaller hospital lab in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, where we have a Vitek. So it was really interesting because I do feel like I sort of had that mentality as a younger tech of having MALDI and just believing it, every result, and having to go backwards and rememorize biochemicals and go back and okay, what is the indole reaction for this? So I think it is a really good point to kind of bring maybe us younger generation back into the critical thinking, biochemical sort of way of thinking. And my question is something that's come up recently in our lab. Actually, this weekend when I was working, we had a sterile cath urine sample on an immunocompromised patient that was alpha hemolytic, pinpoint colonies, gram stained as GPC in clusters. So we're thinking possibly an Aerococcus. Our typical protocol is to put it on a GP card on the Vitek, and it gave a result as Cosuria. And I was like, that's not right. So we repeated it, and the second day it came out as Aerococcus urinae. So we're kind of, and this is the second time that that has happened. And when the Vitek did give a report of the Cosuria, it was like 99%. And so we're almost going to kind of back off from that process, or maybe initiate some sort of, we've never done like an LEP disc, something like that. Do you have any, I guess, tips for Aerococcus workups? Yeah, and that was kind of one of our thoughts too, and it didn't, I mean, obviously Aerococcus is a pretty small, so you can't always see if there's other things. But yeah, and that was kind of our thought too, and it did not appear mixed, but sometimes when they're very small, yeah, you can't always tell if your purity is mixed or not, but thank you.
I'm assuming you moldy them.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, we moldy them. We don't have a standard. I guess we don't automatically do LAP and QIR for an Aerococcus. I admit there's been several times where I've said do them because of a questionable result, but it's not part of our standard automatic, I guess.
Yeah, we tried because on the list of exhaustive things that the Phoenix does identify, it lists Aerococcus. And we tried doing that, and I think we failed every time that we tried it, so we weren't very successful in that. So we're kind of, we do a few general biochemicals, LAP. I think we do a hip urate too to help with it, and report it out as resembling Aerococcus, unless the provider needs or wants a more definitive ID.
All right. I thank you for that conversation, everyone, the discussion. It's been great to hear from all of you. Couldn't have asked more from you, so thank you for sharing. I learned things listening, and I'm sure others here did too. So one thing that I would like to highlight, I think that is a takeaway for me as somebody who's been more in training now at the end of my career, is that we have to, when we're teaching, it's really important to teach the new employees and students, that these instruments are going to fail sometimes, and it's okay to question things. And we have to be open to younger people then coming to those of us that are more experienced and saying, I'm really not quite sure about this. Make the time to listen to them and help them work through their critical thinking to help develop that skill. So I think with that, we can go ahead and go to our break. And we have a little extra time, which is great. There's never enough time to talk at break. So we will start again at 10:15. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to our speakers.